My hands trembled as I applied lipstick for the third time this morning, the coral shade catching the light streaming through my bathroom window. 67 years old, and here I was, primping like a teenager before prom. The mirror reflected back a woman I barely recognized, not because age had been unkind, but because I hadn't seen this particular expression on my face in decades. Anticipation mixed with terror, hope wrestling with the certainty that some chapters should remain closed. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, cream-colored paper with elegant script announcing the 50th reunion of Jefferson High's class of 1975. I'd thrown it in the trash twice, retrieved it both times, and finally tucked it behind a photo of my late husband Robert on the mantel. For 2 weeks it stayed there, a whispered promise I wasn't sure I was brave enough to keep. But this morning, something had shifted. Maybe it was the dream I'd had about dancing in the gymnasium to The Way You Look Tonight, or perhaps it was my daughter Sarah's gentle encouragement during our Sunday call. "Mom," she'd said, "when was the last time you did something that scared you a little?" I couldn't remember. I chose the navy dress, the one that made my gray hair look silver instead of dull, the one that Robert used to say brought out my eyes. My hands shook as I fastened the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. Even now, 5 years after his funeral, I felt like I was betraying him somehow. But wasn't that ridiculous? Robert would have laughed at me, would have pushed me toward the door himself. The community center looked smaller than I remembered, its brick facade weathered but familiar. Cars filled the parking lot, mostly sedans and SUVs, the practical vehicles of people who'd traded sports cars for comfort decades ago. I sat in my Honda for 10 minutes, watching my former classmates emerge from their cars. Some moved slowly, some with canes, others with the confident stride of people who'd aged gracefully into their skin. I recognized Eleanor Watts immediately, though she'd traded her blonde hair for a stunning silver bob. She was laughing with someone I couldn't see, her head thrown back in that same uninhibited way that had made her homecoming queen. For a moment, I was 17 again, watching from the sidelines as the popular kids lived their golden lives. "Get out of the car, Margaret," I whispered to myself, using the stern voice I'd perfected during 30 years of teaching 3rd grade. "You faced down hundreds of 8-year-olds. You can handle this." The gymnasium had been transformed with twinkling lights and round tables covered in white cloth. A DJ played music from our era, songs that immediately transported me back to football games and basement parties, to first kisses and broken hearts. The air smelled like coffee and the same industrial floor cleaner they'd used when we were students. Name tags were arranged alphabetically on a table by the door. I found mine. "Hello, my name is Margaret, Maggie, Chen Williams, class of 75, and peeled off the backing with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The volunteer, a woman I didn't recognize, smiled warmly and handed me a program listing the evening's activities. Maggie Chen. I turned, and there was Linda Morrison, now Linda Castellano, according to her name tag, beaming at me with the same crooked smile I remembered from chemistry class. We fell into the easy rhythm of reunion conversation, children, careers, the classmates we'd lost along the way. Linda worked as a nurse until retirement, had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and was recently widowed herself. "I almost didn't come," I admitted as we made our way to the cash bar. "Oh, honey, me too. After Frank died, I thought I was done with all this." She gestured vaguely at the room full of people, reconnecting, laughing, trying to reconcile their 17-year-old selves with who they'd become. But my kids practically pushed me out the door, said I needed to start living again. Living again. The phrase echoed in my mind as I ordered a white wine, something I rarely did anymore. Robert had been gone 5 years, but I'd been existing rather than living for longer than that, since his diagnosis really, when our world had narrowed to doctor's appointments and treatment schedules and the gradual letting go of dreams we'd planned to chase in retirement. The DJ announced that dinner would be served soon, and people began finding their assigned seats. I scanned the room, looking for table 12, when I saw him. The wine glass slipped from my fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud that seemed impossibly loud in my ears. David Martinelli stood near the far wall, older but unmistakably himself. His dark hair had gone completely silver, and lines mapped the face I'd once traced with my fingertips. But his posture was the same, slightly slouched, hands in his pockets, surveying the room with those thoughtful brown eyes I'd fallen into at 17. 52 years. 52 years since I'd seen him, since the night he told me he was leaving for college in California and wasn't sure long distance would work. Since I'd cried myself to sleep and sworn I'd never let anyone hurt me that way again. Since I'd met Robert 6 months later and discovered that love could be comfortable and safe instead of wild and terrifying. David looked up then, as if he'd felt my stare. Our eyes met across the room, and I saw his intake of breath, the slight step backward as recognition dawned. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room continued to buzz around us, conversations and laughter and the clinking of glasses, but we existed in a pocket of stillness, two people suspended between past and present. He started walking toward me, and I realized I had a choice to make. I could retreat to the bathroom, slip out the back door, return to my quiet house and my settled life. Or I could stand here and let the past collide with whatever future I might still have left. My feet stayed planted on the cheap gymnasium carpet as David Martinelli walked back into my life. Maggie. My name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like a secret he'd been keeping for half a century. Up close, I could see the boy I loved in the lines around his eyes, in the way his mouth still quirked up at the left corner when he was nervous. "Hello, David." My voice came out steadier than I'd expected, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. We stood there for a moment, two old people drowning in decades of unspoken words. He looked good, older, yes, but healthy, fit. The kind of aging that suggested tennis lessons and regular checkups and someone who'd taken care of himself. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," he said finally. "I almost didn't come myself. Linda Morrison, Linda Castellano now, she convinced me. Well, that and my daughter. Why was I babbling? At 67, surely I'd outgrown the nervous chatter that had plagued me as a teenager." "Your daughter?" he repeated, and something flickered across his face. "You have children?" "Just Sarah. She's 38 now, lives in Portland with her husband and 2 kids. I paused, unsure why I felt compelled to add, "My husband passed 5 years ago." David's expression softened. "I'm sorry. I heard, well, I kept track sometimes, through mutual friends. I heard you married Robert Williams, that you taught at the elementary school." The idea that he'd kept track of me sent an unexpected warmth through my chest. "What about you? Are you married?" "Divorced. About 10 years now." He shrugged, a gesture so familiar it made my throat tight. 2 kids, both grown. Michael's a doctor in Seattle, and Lisa teaches at UC Berkeley. I retired from the engineering firm last year. The DJ announced that dinner was being served, and people began moving toward their assigned tables. David glanced at his name tag, then at mine. "Table 12, he said with a rueful smile. "You?" I looked down at my program, certain I'd misread, but there it was, Table 12. The committee has a sense of humor. Or maybe they remember. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary. Would you like to sit together, or would that be too weird?" Too weird. As if anything about this evening could qualify as normal. As if my entire body wasn't vibrating with the strangeness of standing next to someone who'd once known every secret I possessed. I think weird might be exactly what I need, I heard myself say. Table 12 was mercifully filled with people I only vaguely remembered, which meant we could focus on polite small talk about careers and grandchildren without diving into deeper waters. But I was acutely aware of David beside me, the way he still gestured with his hands when he talked, the way he listened with his whole body when someone else spoke. During the salad course, Mrs. Henderson, who taught us both senior English, stopped by our table. She had to be 90 if she was a day, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Margaret Chen and David Martinelli, she said, shaking her head with amusement. I always wondered what happened to you two. You were inseparable senior year. Heat rose in my cheeks, but David just smiled. Mrs. Henderson, you look exactly the same. Flatterer, though I suppose at my age that's less compliment and more miracle. She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. You know, I always thought you two would end up together. You had that look, like you were sharing secrets with each other even when you weren't talking. After she moved on to terrorize another table, David and I sat in silence for a moment, the weight of roads not taken pressed down between us like a third presence at the table. She's not wrong, he said quietly, about the secrets, I mean. I told you things I never told anyone else. I remembered summer nights on his parents' front porch, talking until dawn about everything and nothing. The way he'd confessed his fear that he wasn't smart enough for engineering school, how I'd shared my secret dream of writing a novel someday. We'd been 17 and 18, old enough to think we knew everything, young enough to believe love conquered all. I was so angry with you, I said, surprised by my own honesty. The wine was making me brave, or maybe it was the way the gymnasium lights caught the silver in his hair, reminding me that we were running out of time for careful words. I know. I was angry with myself. He turned to face me fully. Every day for about 10 years, then every month for another 10. And then, well, eventually, you learn to live with the choices you make. Why? The question I'd been carrying for 5 decades finally found its voice. Why did you leave? David was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Around us, the reunion continued. Speeches from the class president, a memorial for classmates who died, the presentation of awards for various achievements. But we existed in our own bubble of unfinished business. Because I loved you too much, he said finally. Because at 18, I was terrified that if I stayed, I'd never be anything more than the guy who was lucky enough to love Maggie Chen. I thought I needed to find out who I was on my own before I could be half of something with you. The words hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I'd believed he'd left because loving me hadn't been enough. The truth was so much more complicated, so much more heartbreaking. And did you? I asked. Find out who you were? He considered this, his fingers tracing patterns on the white tablecloth. I became a successful engineer, built bridges and buildings, contributed to my community, raised 2 kids who are better people than I am, had a marriage that was comfortable, adequate. But I never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. The evening was winding down around us. The DJ had moved into slow songs, and couples were drifting onto the makeshift dance floor. Some moved with the careful precision of people whose joints no longer cooperated. Others swayed with the easy confidence of those who'd been dancing together for decades. David and I had somehow ended up alone at our table, the other seats abandoned as our table mates mingled or headed home early. We'd been talking for hours, touching up on the broad strokes of our lives, carefully avoiding the deeper currents of regret and what if that threatened to pull us under. Maggie, he said, and something in his tone made me look up from the coffee I'd been stirring absently. Would you like to dance? The question hung between us like a challenge. On the dance floor, I could see Eleanor Watts swaying with her husband of 43 years, Linda Castellano laughing as she attempted to follow her date's uncertain steps. Normal people living their normal lives, not wrestling with ghosts and choices made in 1975. I don't know if that's a good idea, I said, though every cell in my body was screaming yes. One dance, he said, for old time's sake. Old time's sake. As if what we'd shared could be reduced to nostalgia, filed away under sweet memories and forgotten again. But maybe that's all this was. Two old people indulging in a moment of harmless sentimentality. I let him lead me to the dance floor as the DJ started playing Unchained Melody. Of course, the universe had apparently decided subtlety was overrated. David's arms came around me with the tentative care of someone afraid he might break what he was holding. But as we began to move together, muscle memory kicked in. My hand found its place on his shoulder, his settled at the small of my back, and suddenly we were 17 again, dancing in the same gymnasium after the homecoming game. "You still fit perfectly," he murmured, and I felt the vibration of his words through his chest. I should have stepped away then, should have remembered that I was a widow, a grandmother, a woman who'd built a life on stability and routine. Should have reminded myself that some chapters are meant to stay closed. Instead, I let myself melt into him, let my cheek rest against his shoulder, breathed in the scent that was somehow still familiar beneath 50 years of different colognes and life experiences. "I used to dream about this," I whispered, the admission slipping out before I could stop it. His arms tightened around me almost imperceptibly. "About dancing? About seeing you again, about getting the chance to say all the things I never got to say." I lifted my head to meet his eyes. "I wrote you letters for years. Never sent them, but I wrote them." "I wrote them too," he said. "Must have started 100 letters over the years. Threw them all away." We swayed together as the song played on, both of us lost in the strange alchemy of memory and desire. Around us, the gymnasium faded away. The other dancers, the decorations, the passage of time itself, none of it mattered in this moment. There was only the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my cheek, and the impossible fact that after 52 years, we still moved together like we'd never stopped. When the song ended, we stood still in the middle of the dance floor, neither of us quite ready to let go. Other couples continued swaying around us, but we existed in a pocket of stillness, two people trying to figure out how to navigate the space between what was and what might have been. "Maggie," David said finally, "I know this is crazy, but would you have coffee with me sometime? I mean, really coffee, not here, not surrounded by all this." He gestured vaguely at the reunion decorations, the gradually emptying gymnasium. I knew I should say no, should thank him for the dance, for the trip down memory lane, and then drive home to my quiet house and my settled life. Should remember that I was 67 years old, too old for the kind of upheaval that David represented. But looking into his eyes, I saw something I recognized. The same careful hope I'd been nurturing for weeks, the same whispered question, what if it's not too late? "Yes," I said, "I'd like that." The smile that spread across his face was worth every moment of terror, every carefully constructed wall I was about to let crumble. We exchanged phone numbers like teenagers, our fingers brushing as he handed me his business card. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "There's a little place called Rosemary's on 5th Street. Do you know it?" I knew it, had driven past it 100 times, always meaning to stop in, but never quite finding the courage to sit alone in a cafe full of couples and friends. 2 o'clock? Perfect. The reunion was officially over now, people gathering their belongings and making their way to the parking lot. We walked together toward the door, our steps synchronized in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. Outside, the April air was crisp and star-filled. David walked me to my car, his hands in his pockets, that old slouch more pronounced now, but somehow still endearing. "Maggie," he said as I fumbled for my keys, "I want you to know, seeing you tonight, it's been—" He paused, searching for words. "It's been like finding a piece of myself I thought was lost forever." I understood exactly what he meant. For 5 years since Robert's death, I'd been existing in a carefully controlled world, content to be Sarah's mother and the grandmother who sent birthday cards and Christmas presents. I'd convinced myself that romance was for younger people, that I'd had my great love and lost it, and that was enough for one lifetime. But standing here in the parking lot of my old high school, looking at a man who'd once promised to love me forever, I felt something I'd thought was gone for good. Hope, possibility, the terrifying, exhilarating sense that maybe my story wasn't over after all. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said, getting into my car before I could change my mind. As I drove home through streets I'd traveled thousands of times, past the park where David had first kissed me and the corner where we'd said goodbye, I felt like I was waking up from a very long sleep. Tomorrow would bring coffee and conversation and all the complications that came with opening your heart again at 67. But tonight, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt truly, completely alive. I changed clothes 4 times before settling on jeans and a soft blue sweater, casual but not sloppy, put together but not trying too hard. At least that's what I told myself as I checked my appearance in the hallway mirror for the 5th time. The morning had passed in a blur of nervous energy. I'd cleaned my already spotless kitchen, called Sarah just to hear her voice, and Googled David's name more times than I cared to admit. The search results painted a picture of a successful man, mentions in engineering journals, photos from charity events, a brief article about his firm's work on a bridge renovation. In one picture, he was smiling beside a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair. His ex-wife, I assumed, though the caption didn't say. Rosemary's Cafe sat on a corner I'd driven past countless times, its cheerful yellow awning and flower boxes always managing to catch my eye. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. Exposed brick walls covered with local artwork, mismatched chairs around small wooden tables, the rich aroma of coffee and fresh-baked pastries. David was already there when I arrived, rising from a table near the window as I walked in. He'd chosen well. The spot offered privacy while still being open enough that we wouldn't feel trapped in intimacy if the conversation went badly. "You look beautiful," he said as I approached, and I felt that familiar flush of heat in my cheeks. "You don't have to say that," I replied, hanging my purse on the back of my chair. "I know I don't have to. I want to." He waited until I was seated before sitting down himself, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that reminded me of how different dating had been when we were young. "I already ordered for myself. Hope that's okay. Wasn't sure when you'd get here." "Actually, I've been sitting in my car for 10 minutes, working up the courage to come in." He laughed, and the sound sent a familiar warmth through my chest. "I got here 30 minutes early and have been checking my watch every 2 minutes since then. I think we're both a little nervous." A waitress appeared, young enough to be my granddaughter, with pink streaks in her hair and a sleek smile. I ordered a latte and a blueberry scone, though I doubted I'd be able to eat anything with my stomach doing acrobatic flips. "So," David said, once we were alone again, "this is strange, isn't it?" "The strangest thing I've done in years," I admitted. "My daughter would be shocked if she knew I was here." "Would she disapprove?" I considered this. Sarah had been gently encouraging me to get out more, to consider dating again, though I'd always brushed off her suggestions. Actually, she'd probably be thrilled. She's been worried about me being lonely. "Are you?" The question was direct, honest in a way that cut through small talk to something deeper. I found myself answering with equal honesty. I thought I'd gotten used to it. After Robert died, I convinced myself I was fine with quiet dinners and empty beds and having no one to discuss the evening news with. But last night, dancing with you, I realized I'd been lonely for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. Our drinks arrived, providing a momentary distraction from the intensity of the admission I'd just made. David stirred sugar into his coffee with the same deliberate motions I remembered, and I wondered if he was buying time to formulate a response. "I married Carol 3 years after I left here," he said finally. "Nice woman. Smart, funny when she wanted to be. We had good years together, especially when the kids were young. But there was always something." He paused, searching for the right word. "Missing. Like I was playing a part instead of living my real life." I understood. Robert had been a good husband, faithful, kind, a wonderful father. Our marriage had been built on mutual respect and genuine affection. But it had never had the electric quality of what I'd shared with David, the sense that we were two halves of the same soul. "Do you think that's fair?" I asked. "To our spouses, I mean. To compare them to what we had when we were 17? "Probably not, but we do it anyway, don't we?" He met my eyes across the small table. "Carol used to say I was somewhere else sometimes, even when I was sitting right next to her. She wasn't wrong." I thought of Robert, patient and steady, never complaining when I'd drift off during conversations or stare out windows with that faraway look he'd learned to recognize. Had he known? Had he sensed that part of me was perpetually 17, still dancing in a high school gymnasium with a boy who'd broken my heart? "I feel guilty," I said, "being here with you, feeling whatever this is. Like I'm betraying Robert's memory." David reached across the table and covered my hand with his. The touch sent electricity up my arm, and I had to resist the urge to pull away. "Robert loved you, right? Wanted you to be happy?" "Of course." "Then he'd want this for you. Maybe not with me specifically," David added with a wry smile, "but he'd want you to have love in your life again." I turned my hand palm up, lacing our fingers together. His skin was soft but strong, marked with age spots and the calluses of a man who'd worked with his hands. Real, present, not a memory or a ghost, but flesh and blood and possibility. "Tell me about your children," I said, needing to steer the conversation toward safer ground. His face lit up with the particular pride that comes from watching your children become better people than you thought possible. He told me about Michael, the cardiologist who volunteered at free clinics, and Lisa, the professor who just published a book on sustainable urban planning. I shared stories about Sarah, her work as a social worker, her kids who were the light of my life. We talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing with the easy rhythm of people who'd once known each other inside and out. There were awkward moments, references to spouses and experiences we hadn't shared, but underneath it all was the foundation of recognition. We'd both grown up, changed, accumulated decades of experience and wisdom and scars, but the essential connection remained. "I should probably go," I said finally, noticing that the afternoon crowd was beginning to thin out. "I have dinner plans with my neighbor." This was true, though Mrs. Patterson would understand if I canceled. "Of course." David signaled for the check, but I reached for my purse. "We should split it." "Absolutely not." He gave me a look that was part amusement, part gentle reproach. "I asked you to coffee. I'm buying coffee." Outside the cafe, we stood on the sidewalk in the kind of awkward moment that marks the end of first dates, even when the participants are old enough to be grandparents. I felt 17 again, wondering if he'd try to kiss me, hoping he would and wouldn't in equal measure. "Maggie," he said, stepping closer, "I'd like to see you again. I know this is complicated, and I know we're probably both crazy for thinking we can pick up where we left off 50 years ago, but I'd like to try." The sensible part of me, the part that had learned to be careful, to protect my heart, to avoid unnecessary complications, wanted to thank him for the coffee and walk away. But the part that had spent half a century wondering what if was stronger. "So would I said. This time he did kiss me, soft and careful, a question more than a statement, his lips barely brushing mine before pulling back to gauge my reaction. It was nothing like the passionate kisses we'd shared as teenagers, all urgent hands and desperate promises. This was sweeter somehow, weighted with the knowledge of how precious and fragile connection could be. "Dinner tomorrow?" he asked. "I know a place." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He waited until I was in my car before walking to his own, a silver Camry parked 2 spaces down. As I drove home, I caught myself smiling for the first time since I could remember. But beneath the smile was a growing awareness that I was standing at a crossroads. I could keep seeing David, let whatever this was develop, risk the comfortable life I'd built for the possibility of something more. Or I could step back now, before either of us got too invested, and preserve the perfect memory of what we'd been. The smart money was on stepping back. At 67, I was too old for heartbreak, too settled for upheaval. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw the empty house waiting for me, I realized I was also too old to waste time on fear. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The Italian restaurant David chose was small and intimate, the kind of place where couples celebrated anniversaries and held hands across red checkered tablecloths. I almost turned around when I saw it, convinced I wasn't ready for this level of romantic intention. But David was waiting by the door with flowers, simple daisies that somehow meant more than roses would have. "You remembered," I said, accepting the bouquet. "That daisies were your favorite? Some things you don't forget." He held the door open for me, and I caught a hint of the cologne he'd worn in high school, or maybe one that was similar enough to trigger the memory. Inside, the hostess led us to a corner table that offered privacy without feeling isolated. David pulled out my chair, another gesture from a more courtly time, and I found myself remembering why I'd fallen so hard for him all those years ago. It wasn't just that he'd been handsome, though he had been. It was the way he paid attention, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the room who mattered. "You're quiet tonight," he said after we'd ordered wine and appetizers. "I'm scared," I admitted. This morning I was excited, this afternoon I was nervous, and now I'm terrified. Of me? Of this? Of what it means? Of how much I want it to work? The words came out in a rush, more honest than I'd intended to be. David reached across the table and took my hand, the gesture becoming natural with repetition. "Do you want to know what terrifies me?" I nodded. That I'm going to mess this up again. That I'm going to hurt you or disappoint you or prove that some chances only come once in a lifetime. He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. But I'm more scared of not trying, of walking away and spending whatever time I have left wondering what might have been. Our wine arrived, providing a moment of distraction as we went through the ritual of tasting and approving. The server was older than the girl from the cafe, probably in her 40s, and she had the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned to fade into the background while couples worked through their dramas. "To second chances," David said, raising his glass. "To second chances," I echoed, though my voice caught slightly on the words. The conversation over dinner was easier than it had been at the cafe, lubricated by wine and the growing familiarity of spending time together. We talked about books we'd read, places we'd traveled, the way the world had changed since we were young. David had been to Europe several times for work, had seen the Colosseum and the Eiffel Tower and the Northern Lights from a hotel room in Finland. I'd traveled less, a few family trips when Sarah was young, a cruise with Robert for our 30th anniversary, but I'd found richness in smaller adventures, in the daily discoveries that came from really paying attention to the world around you. "I always wondered if you wrote that novel," David said as we shared tiramisu, taking turns with the same spoon in an intimacy that felt both new and ancient. "I started it, several times actually, but life got in the way, teaching, raising Sarah, taking care of my parents when they got older. I kept telling myself I'd have time later." I shrugged, a gesture I hoped conveyed acceptance rather than regret. Maybe later is now. What would it be about? A woman who gets a second chance at love when she's least expecting it. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Or maybe not. I haven't really thought it through. David's smile was soft and understanding. I think it sounds like a story worth telling. After dinner, we walked to his car in companionable silence. The night was clear and warm for April, and I found myself reluctant for the evening to end. When David suggested a drive, I heard myself agree before my rational mind could object. He drove us to Riverside Park, where we'd spent countless hours as teenagers. The place had been updated, new playground equipment, paved walking paths, better lighting, but the basic bones were the same. The river still flowed past, dark and steady, carrying secrets downstream the way it had for 100 years. I used to come here sometimes, David said as we sat on a bench near the water. When I was in town visiting my parents after they got too old to live alone, I'd sit here and think about us, about the night we broke up. I remembered that night with painful clarity. We'd sat on a bench not far from this one, both of us crying, as David explained that he'd gotten the scholarship, that California was too good an opportunity to pass up, that maybe we should see other people since we'd be so far apart. I was so angry with you, I said, the old hurt surfacing despite the years. Not just for leaving, but for making the decision without me. Like what we had didn't matter enough to fight for. It mattered too much, David said quietly. I was 18 and terrified and completely overwhelmed by how much I loved you. It felt like drowning and flying at the same time, and I didn't know how to handle it. And now? How does it feel now? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dark water. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Like coming home. Something broke open in my chest at those words, a dam I'd built over decades of careful living and protected emotions. Before I could think or rationalize or talk myself out of it, I leaned over and kissed him, really kissed him, with all the passion and longing I'd been holding back. He responded immediately, his arms coming around me, pulling me closer, as 52 years of separation collapsed into nothing. This wasn't the careful, tentative kiss from yesterday. This was need and hunger and the desperate desire to make up for lost time. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Maggie, David said, and my name sounded like a prayer on his lips. I know this is crazy, I said. I know we're probably too old for this, too set in our ways, too everything. But I don't care anymore. I've spent 5 decades being sensible, and look where it's gotten me. Alone in a house that's too big, living like I'm already dead. You're not alone now. No, I said, finally allowing myself to smile without reservation. I'm not. We stayed by the river until nearly midnight, talking and kissing, and slowly allowing ourselves to believe that maybe it wasn't too late after all. When David finally drove me home, I invited him in for coffee, and we both knew it was about more than caffeine. My house felt different with David in it, more alive somehow, as if his presence had awakened rooms that had been sleeping. We sat on my couch, talking in quiet voices, his arm around my shoulders, my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. I should probably go, he said eventually, though he made no move to leave. Probably, I agreed, also not moving. Your neighbors will talk. Let them talk. I'm 67 years old. I think I've earned the right to scandalize the neighborhood. But when he did leave an hour later, I walked him to the door with a mixture of contentment and anticipation I hadn't felt in decades. He kissed me goodnight on my front porch, under the light I'd installed for security, but which now felt romantic, and promised to call me in the morning. As I watched his taillights disappear down my quiet street, I realized I was standing at the threshold of something that could change everything. 3 weeks later, I was in David's kitchen, teaching him how to make my grandmother's dumpling recipe while he attempted to tell me about bridge engineering, a combination that should have been chaotic, but somehow worked perfectly. Flour dusted his hair, I had soy sauce on my sweater, and we were both laughing at the spectacular failure of his first attempt at pleating. I build structures that support thousands of tons of weight, he said, holding up a dumpling that looked more like abstract art than food. Why can't I fold a simple piece of dough? Different kind of engineering, I said, moving behind him to guide his hands. Feel the dough. It should be firm but yielding, like... I paused, suddenly aware of how close we were standing, of the warmth of his back against my chest. Like what? His voice was lower now, rougher. Like trust, I finished quietly. He turned in my arms then, flour-covered hands coming up to cup my face. I trust you, Maggie, more than I've trusted anyone in 50 years. The kiss that followed was interrupted by the timer on the oven, where the first batch of dumplings was steaming, but neither of us moved immediately. We'd been moving slowly, carefully, like two people learning to walk again after long illnesses. There had been dinners and movies, long walks and longer conversations, but we hadn't crossed the line into physical intimacy beyond kisses that left us both breathless and wanting more. I should check those, I said, though I made no move to step away. Probably, he agreed, also staying put. The dumplings were perfect when we finally rescued them, golden and bursting with flavor. We ate them at his small dining table, talking about everything and nothing, the easy conversation of people who were rapidly becoming essential to each other's daily existence. After dinner, David made coffee while I studied the photographs on his mantel. There were pictures of his children at various ages, his parents, what looked like vacation shots from various trips, and there, tucked behind a photo of his daughter's college graduation, was something that made my breath catch. It was a picture of us from senior year, taken at the winter formal. I was wearing a blue dress that my mother had spent weeks saving for, and David was in a rented tuxedo that was slightly too big. We looked impossibly young and ridiculously happy, his arm around my waist, my head tilted toward his shoulder. "You kept this," I said when he returned with the coffee. He followed my gaze and had the grace to look embarrassed. "I know, it's probably weird. Carol used to ask about it sometimes, but I could never bring myself to throw it away." I thought of the shoebox in my closet that contained letters I'd never sent, ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together, dried corsages from dances I'd attended on his arm. Some things are too precious to discard, no matter how much they hurt to keep. I kept things too, I admitted. Robert knew about you. Not everything, but enough. He used to joke that he was married to 2 people, me and the ghost of my first love. Did it bother him? I think it did, sometimes, but he was generous enough not to say so. I picked up the photograph, studying our younger selves. Do you think they'd recognize us now? David considered this seriously. I think they'd be surprised by how much we've changed and how much we've stayed the same. That girl in the picture, she was brave and smart and had the biggest heart of anyone I knew. Those things haven't changed. That boy was going to change the world. Maybe I did, in small ways, one bridge at a time. He paused, then added quietly, "But the most important thing I ever did was love you, and I never stopped." The words hung between us like a bridge of their own, spanning decades of separation and hurt and might-have-beens. I set the photograph down and turned to face him fully. "David," I said, then stopped, unsure how to voice what I was feeling. "I know," he said. "I feel it too. Like we're 17 again, but also like we're exactly as old as we are, and both things are true at the same time. I'm scared. So am I." but I'm more scared of wasting whatever time we have left being careful." He took my hand and led me to the couch, where we sat close together, my legs curled under me, his arm around my shoulders. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the room in golden light that made everything look touched by magic. "Maggie," he said, and I could hear the question in his voice before he asked it. Would you consider staying tonight?" My heart hammered against my ribs. It had been over 6 years since I'd been intimate with anyone, 5 years since Robert had been strong enough for more than gentle kisses and holding hands. The thought of being vulnerable with David, of letting him see all the ways my body had aged and changed, was terrifying. But the thought of walking away, of going home to my empty house and my careful routines, was worse. "Yes," I said, "I'd like that." What happened next was nothing like the passionate fumbling of our youth. We moved slowly, gently, with the reverence of people who understood how rare and precious intimacy could be. David's hands shook as he helped me out of my sweater, and I could feel my own trembling as I unbuttoned his shirt. We were both different, softer in some places, marked by time and gravity and the accumulation of years. But we were also more ourselves than we'd ever been, freed from the insecurities and awkwardness of youth by the simple fact that we'd survived long enough to find each other again. Afterward, lying in his bed with my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat gradually slow to normal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete contentment. Not just physical satisfaction, though that had been wonderful and surprising in its intensity, but the deep peace that comes from being exactly where you belong. "I love you," David said into the darkness. "I've loved you for 52 years, and I'm going to love you for however much time we have left." "I love you too," I whispered back, "and I'm done being scared of it." Outside, the world continued its usual rhythms, but inside David's small house, 2 people who'd thought their story was over discovered they were actually just beginning a new chapter. 6 months later, I was packing boxes in my living room, wrapping my mother's china in newspaper, while Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through photo albums. "I still can't believe you're selling the house," she said, holding up a picture of herself at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning. "I thought you'd never leave." "I thought so too," I admitted, carefully nestling a teacup into its protective wrapping. "But it's too big for just me, and David's place has that wonderful garden. Besides, this house has too many memories. It's time to make new ones." Sarah looked up from the album, studying my face with the penetrating gaze she'd inherited from her father. "You're really happy, aren't you?" "Terrified and ecstatic and completely out of my comfort zone," I said. "But yes, I'm happy." It had been a whirlwind 6 months. David and I had fallen into a routine of spending most nights together, alternating between his house and mine. We'd taken weekend trips to the coast, to the mountains, to visit his daughter in California, where I'd been welcomed with the kind of warmth that suggested Lisa had been worried about her father's loneliness for years. The decision to sell my house and move in with David had been gradual, then sudden. One morning over coffee, he'd mentioned that his neighbor was putting their house on the market and how nice it would be to have more space for when the grandkids visited. By afternoon, we were calling real estate agents. "What would Dad think?" Sarah asked quietly, carefully placing the photo back in the album. It was a question I'd asked myself 100 times. "I think your father would want me to be happy." He knew better than anyone that love isn't a finite resource. You don't run out of it by giving it to someone new. "He used to say that about having children," Sarah said with a small smile, "that parents don't love their first child less when they have a second one. The heart just expands." Smart man, your father. We worked in comfortable silence for a while. the late afternoon sun streaming through windows that would soon belong to someone else. The house felt different already, less like home and more like a collection of rooms waiting for new stories. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "How's the packing going? I made soup for dinner, and I may have bought wine to celebrate surviving the first day of combining our book collections." I smiled, typing back, "Books are winning the war against closet space. We'll be there by 6. Save me some wine." "What are you grinning about?" Sarah asked. "David made soup. He's been cooking for me constantly since I agreed to move in. I think he's afraid I'll change my mind if he stops feeding me." "Will you change your mind?" I considered the question seriously. Moving in together at our age felt simultaneously like the most natural thing in the world and the biggest risk I'd ever taken. We'd never lived together before, never had to negotiate daily routines and personal habits and all the small compromises that long-term cohabitation required. "I might," I said honestly. "We both might. We're set in our ways, probably too old to be learning how to share space with someone new. But we're also too old to waste time being cautious. If it doesn't work, we'll figure something else out. And if it does work..." I trailed off, not wanting to tempt fate by voicing my hopes out loud. Sarah stood up, brushing dust off her jeans, and came over to hug me. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for being brave enough to try." That evening, I stood in David's kitchen, our kitchen now, watching him stir soup while jazz played softly from the radio. He'd rearranged his furniture to make room for some of my pieces, and the result was eclectic but somehow harmonious, like two melodies combining to create something richer than either could manage alone. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, noticing my contemplation. "Just thinking about how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was convinced my story was over, that I'd had my great love, raised my child, lived my life, and all that was left was to age gracefully and wait for whatever comes next. And now I feel like I'm just getting started." I moved behind him, wrapping my arms around his waist, resting my cheek against his back. Like maybe the story I thought was an ending was really just an intermission. He turned in my arms, soup forgotten for the moment. "I used to have dreams about this," he said, "about us being old together, cooking dinner, and arguing about whose turn it is to do the dishes, and falling asleep reading in the same bed." "Did we argue about dishes in your dreams?" "Constantly. You were very particular about the proper way to load the dishwasher." I laughed, reaching up to smooth a wayward piece of his hair. "I am particular about the dishwasher, and about leaving coffee cups all over the house, and about putting books back where they belong after you're done reading them." "I know. I've been taking notes." His expression grew serious. "Maggie, I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever adjustments we have to make, I'm committed to figuring it out. We've been given something incredible here, a second chance that most people never get. I'm not going to let my stubborn bachelor habits ruin it." "Good," I said, "because I'm not going to let my widow's need for control and quiet ruin it either." We kissed then, soft and sweet, a promise sealed between two people who'd learned that love was worth the risk of disruption, worth the challenge of change, worth the vulnerability of hope. Later, as we ate soup and argued about whether to watch the news or a cooking show, I marveled at how ordinary and extraordinary it all felt. This was what I'd been missing without realizing it, not just romance, but partnership. Someone to share the small moments with, someone whose presence made even the mundane feel significant. Before bed, I called Sarah to report that I'd survived day 1 of cohabitation. "Any major disasters?" she asked. "David reorganized my spice rack," I said. "Apparently, alphabetical order makes more sense than grouping by cuisine type." "Sounds like grounds for breaking up." "I'm considering it," I said with mock seriousness. "But he did make excellent soup, and he's promised to learn my system." Compromise, the foundation of all successful relationships. After I hung up, I found David in the bedroom, reading with his glasses perched on the end of his nose, looking distinguished and comfortable and absolutely perfect in the soft lamplight. He looked up when I entered, marking his place with a finger. "Everything okay?" "Everything's perfect," I said, and realized I meant it completely. As I got ready for bed, brushing my teeth next to his toothbrush, hanging my robe next to his on the bathroom door, I thought about all the small intimacies I'd forgotten existed. The comfort of knowing someone would be there when you woke up, the pleasure of sharing space and routines, the simple joy of falling asleep to the sound of another person breathing. We'd both lived full lives before finding each other again. We'd raised children and buried parents and learned hard lessons about loss and resilience. But lying in bed together, David's arm around me as we talked about plans for tomorrow and next week and next year, I understood that experience hadn't diminished our capacity for wonder. It had deepened it. "David," I said as we settled into sleep. "I'm glad you came to the reunion." "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against my hair. "Well, second best. The first was letting you convince me to try again." "I love you," I said, the words feeling both ancient and brand new. "I love you too, Maggie, forever." As I drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man I'd first loved at 17, I thought about the novel I'd never written, the one about second chances and unexpected reunions. Maybe it was time to start that story after all. Maybe some tales were worth telling, even if you had to live them first to understand how they were supposed to end. Or rather, how they were supposed to begin again.